Thank you very much, Mike. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Mike and Paul, for the kind invitation. I must acknowledge that my invitation arose when one of the speakers unfortunately had to withdraw, and I fear I'm going to be a poor substitute for Dr. Greg Canning, but I hope, nevertheless, that my talk will be of some interest to you. My involvement in the field of forensic science began in forensic anthropology, which is the study of human skeletal remains, typically. And I just want to show one case example. It's actually not a forensic case. It's a body under a patio, but it's a body that's been there for 1,000 years, and somebody had built the patio on top of an Anglo-Saxon graveyard. So this is a sort of the work that at one time I was involved in. And what we find in forensic anthropology is that we deal with both criminal and civil cases that arise from homicide, suicide, fatalities arising after drug or alcohol abuse, and death due to hypothermia or natural causes. And we want to move on beyond the science these days and look at forensic science's role in crime prevention and crime reduction, and more generally in public health and well-being, not just the detective stuff. And this has led me to take an interest in what factors may underlie some of these apparently quite diverse issues. And one issue that arises quite a lot, I think, with suicide and drug abuse are quite early problems in development, which I think some of you in the audience will be far more familiar with than I am, relating to bonding with early caregivers. Attachment theory is the primary model for these things, but things like fear of abandonment, fear of intimacy due to fear of abandonment, I think they often underlie quite a lot of these problems, and probably problems that we discuss commonly in men's issues politics as well. There's certainly a preponderance of males in these cases, and I've worked with colleagues in Brazil who find exactly the same thing. But it's not on the policy radar. And we're trapped in a particular paradigm that I think we're aware of, which really excludes dealing with these kinds of issues in the way that I think they should properly be addressed from a scientific point of view. And this brings me on to why is it that these are not on the policy radar? It also happens that forensic science is not on the policy radar. CSI is a franchise from CBS that's worth $1 billion. Well, the entire forensic science market in the UK is worth less than £1 million. So the reality of forensic science is very different from CSI, and there's a field of scholarship called public choice theory, which is probably worth me suggesting you take a look into, because I think it probably explains why a lot of our issues just don't get on the policy radar. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit about forensic science and CSI. CSI, the TV program, obviously real forensic science, as you might anticipate, is not very much like it. What CSI is a type of genre called a police procedural. And these stories actually go back a very long way. And I want to talk about a couple of illustrative examples because I think they're actually quite pertinent to our debate today. I'll leave it to you to decide what you think, but I'll put them before you and see what you think. This is a sculpture from Palmyra in Syria, the place that was occupied by ISIS until quite recently. But this particular sculpture was retrieved and it's in a museum in the United States. So it's not been blown up, hopefully, because it's in the States. But it depicts the priests of the god Baal, or Baal, or Bel. So these are the priests of Baal from ancient Babylon. And this I want to take you back to biblical times where, according to the book of Daniel, Daniel was exiled to ancient Babylon in the time of King Cyrus the Great of Persia. And he was in Babylon at the time of the priests of Baal, which we can actually see depicted in this sculpture. The story goes that Daniel, being Jewish, didn't believe in the idols of Babylon. He didn't believe in the god Baal. And a discussion arose, apparently, with King Cyrus, whereby the priests of Baal said, well, we know Baal's a living god. Look at all the food he eats and the wine that he drinks every night. 40 sheep go into the temple and none come out. 6 casks of wine go in and none come out. And Daniel says, well, but hang on a minute. The god Baal is just a stone idol coated in bronze. He's not real and he can't eat anything. And a dispute arises, and Daniel's threatened with death for his blasphemy. So he's in big trouble, and he thinks, how can I get out of this problem? And what he decides to do, talking quietly to King Cyrus, apparently, is to put ash on the floor of the temple. So he coats the floor of the temple with ash and locks up. And Daniel and King Cyrus retire for the night. And they come back in the morning, and the floor of the temple is covered with the footprints of the priests of Baal and their wives and children. And so Daniel's able to use a prototype forensic technique to establish... Daniel was a prototype forensic footprint analyst who managed to establish the reality of events. So he was up against very powerful vested interests, and he used physical evidence to show what the truth really was. And I'm afraid that as a consequence, this is the biblical times that we're talking about. Cyrus had the priests of Baal and their wives and children put to death. No messing about. Now, surprisingly, you might think, the people, the multitude, the mob, the rabble, were really quite upset that Daniel had come along and had the idols tipped over and the priests cast out. They felt that their future had been stolen. So this is why Daniel finished up in the lion's den, because he upset the multitude by getting rid of their gods and false prophets. And I'm not trying to claim there's an analogy there with Brexit. And moving on to another tale from the book of Daniel, which might be relevant. It's the tale of Susanna and the elders. This is a depiction by Tintoretto. And there are depictions also by other great masters like Rubens, and Susanna's the classic Rubenesque beauty. And the story is that a very chaste Jewish married woman, Susanna, liked to go into the secluded garden and bathe in privacy. And you can see she has all her accoutrements with her for her bathing. But two elders, two lecherous voyeurs, and I have a feeling that Tintoretto is inviting us to be lecherous voyeurs as well, decided that they would go and spy on Susanna. And they tried to proposition her. And when she turned them down, they said, well, we're going to say that you were meeting your boyfriend here, your lover, and you're a harlot, and it's death for you, mate. And so the consequences for Susanna are very serious, and there's a risk that she's going to be put to death. But Daniel comes along and says, well, hang on a minute, surely you need to investigate this story and find out if there's any supporting corroborative evidence. But the multitude believed the elders because they were the people in political authority. They were the judges of the people, and so the people wanted to condemn Susanna to death. I'm afraid I can't find any contemporary Babylonian multitudes, but they were all set to go. They were all set to go, and Daniel said, "Are you so foolish, ye children of Israel, that without examination or knowledge of the truth you condemned a daughter of Israel?" And he said, "Separate these two elders far one from another, and I will examine them." And he asks them to give an account of the evening and the events and the location. And in the garden there were some trees. And one of the elders said, well, we were sitting under a mastic tree, which is a relative of the pistachio. And the other elder said that we were sitting under a holm oak, which is an oak tree. And they're really quite distinctive. So as well as being a prototype forensic footwear analyst, Daniel was a prototype forensic botanist, and he was able to check the story and identify the trees. The two accounts were conflicting and not reconcilable with the plants in the garden, and they were shown to be lying. So as a consequence of which they were put to death. The elders were put to death. So my second point that I want to make is with the story of Baal, we have physical evidence being used to physically show what the events were. With the story of Susanna and the elders, were using evidence to distinguish between two particular accounts of events and to look at witness credibility and reliability. So these issues go back a long way in our history. They're not new things. I want to move to the development of more recent forensic science and a story from France regarding a serial killer called Vacher, who was called the killer of the little shepherds. There's a fabulous book by a US journalist, professor called Douglas Starr, about this case. But Vacher was a sort of vagrant who wandered around France, walking 20 or 30 miles a day, but every now and again he would attack and murder people working in the fields, typically shepherds, so he was called the killer of the little shepherds. And at that time in Lyon, in the late Victorian era, there was a professor of forensic medicine called Lacassange, who was one of the first people to use systematic scene of crime recording, to use systematic autopsy or post-mortem examination, and to estimate time since death. And as a consequence of his work, he was actually able to link together different murders that had occurred in what ultimately became quite spread out locations in France, and he was able to show that they were almost certainly perpetrated by the same attacker because of the modus operandi and so on. And ultimately this led to the capture of Vacher. But of course, before they caught Vacher, a lot of other unfortunates got in the frame. So there were at least 3 people falsely accused of murdering these shepherds and shepherdesses. Charles Roux was falsely accused and imprisoned. Bernardine Bagnères, his house was mobbed and stoned by his neighbours. And unscrupulous local journalists, in another case, scapegoated Eugène Grenier and forced him to move to another village. So the mob is out there, and if they can't get the person that really did it, they're very often out to get somebody. These are some traumatised villagers. This is actually a contemporary photograph where they've found the human remains in one of these cases. But just as a reminder, I don't know if you remember the Joanna Yates murder case, those of you from the UK, a young woman murdered in Bristol, and the police decided that her landlord, I think, the press decided that her landlord may have done it, or at least they decided to imply that he did. So these sorts of issues, they haven't changed, and our protection against facing this sort of situation, being falsely accused and so on, they're these very simple principles that we use evidence to check what events occurred, to exclude certain events in the defence of a false accusation, and to check witness reliability to make sure that the accusations are credible and valid and reliable. Moving on to the late Victorian era in the UK, this is the case of Adolf Beck. We're interested in the man at the bottom, whose name turned out to be Wilhelm Meyer of Vienna. He was a Victorian fraudster and con man who would approach ladies in the street and say, "Oh, it's Lady Evison, isn't it?" And the woman, the victim, would be quite startled and said, "No. Oh, yes, I'm Lord Willoughby. I'm sure we met at Arscott last year." So he'd ingratiate himself with these well-to-do ladies and insinuate himself with them, and he would try to suggest to them that they were going to set up some kind of relationship together. I'm not entirely sure how the system worked, but anyway, this is what happened. And he would say, "Well, I see your jewellery is not really the quality that a woman of mine should be wearing. If you give me your old jewellery, I'll take the ring to my jeweller's and have a nice one made for you." And I don't have enough money. I'm afraid I don't have any loose change for my hansom cab. Have you got any change so that I can get home? And so he'd convince the women to hand over some money for him to get a hansom cab, a taxi, as it would be today. And he would say, "But don't worry, I'll write you out a cheque. I'll write you out my cheque to cover your costs, and you can buy a new wardrobe," and so on and so forth. And off he would go with the jewellery and some change for the hansom cab. The cheque would bounce, and the case would become a police case. And this happened in a number of cases. The man at the top was an entirely innocent person who, in the view of these ladies, resembled the fraudster at the bottom. He was imprisoned once falsely on the basis of mistaken identification, and subsequently a new pattern of cases emerged some years later, and the PC that was involved in the original case said, "There's no doubt whatsoever, I know what's at stake, and I'm sure without doubt he is the man." So the policeman was quite convinced that they'd got the right guy, and they hadn't. And it was only when a case came to light where Beck was in prison on remand, and it couldn't possibly have been him, that they began to realise that there definitely had been a miscarriage of justice. Interestingly enough, Beck was Jewish and Meyer wasn't, so that they would have been able to distinguish between the two men quite early in the case if they'd looked into that type of issue because of circumcision. So as a consequence of this error, there was an investigation, and Beck was exonerated, and for this and a number of other reasons, the Court of Criminal Appeal was established in the United Kingdom, so that a criminal case wasn't automatic over just because there'd been an original trial and finding of the court. In the event of some new information coming to light or some other error, in principle at least, one could take the case to the Court of Appeal to have it potentially reopened. So I've talked about physical evidence in terms of the event. I've talked about evidence in relation to witness credibility and reliability, and I've talked about the particular case of problems with mistaken eyewitness evidence, particularly in relation to identification. It's very problematic, and judges are meant to warn courts now in relation to eyewitness identification. They're meant to warn jurors about the problems that may arise. How long ago was it you saw the individual concerned? What was the light like? What was the pose angle like? And so on and so forth. So we know that, unfortunately, a certain proportion of criminal cases do end in wrongful convictions. There's a fantastic amount of work been done in the US on this in recent years, particularly because of the introduction of forensic DNA profiling. This has allowed exhibits in cases where the conviction is disputed to be re-examined, leading to a lot of exonerations of wrongful convictions. Not just these days from DNA, I must say, but certainly that was an important stimulus. And this slide shows the 1,830 exonerations examined by an exoneration project. And you can see that child sexual abuse and sexual assault and homicide are amongst the leading proportion of cases within which miscarriages of justice have evidently occurred. And if you look at the coloured bars, you'll see that amongst them, mistaken eyewitness identification and perjury or false accusation commonly feature as underlying the cause of the false conviction in the first place. So we have a problem with in miscarriage of justice when we look into the reasons why. Mistaken identification is a problem. People telling lies is a problem. People making false accusations is a problem, evidently. And again, this just illustrates the proportion of these particular cases within which an eyewitness has lied or there's been a perjury or a false accusation. And as you can see, they if you look down on the column on the right, you can see that they form quite a substantial number of these exoneration cases. This is from the US, and there's an issue with the, in inverted commas, race of the person that's been convicted and subsequently exonerated. There's quite a high proportion of people that come from the black community that find themselves involved in wrongful miscarriage of justice. Interestingly enough, it's only child sex abuse where white people seem to be the ones that are involved, and in this instance, proportionately more commonly exonerated. Amongst those 1,830 cases, there's a person, typically a man, not always, but almost always, and families and people's lives destroyed, people spending decades in prison, including probably about 20 cases where people have been on death row and then subsequently exonerated. And this is just one example. It's seen as a stereotype example, in which case, in the case in which a black man is accused, the jury is all white, and it's a cross-racial crime. A black man has allegedly raped a white woman. And sometimes there's also an issue of cross-racial lineups for eyewitness identification. We know that we tend to be better at recognising people within our own, in inverted commas, racial group. So if you have cross-racial identification, there's a greater chance of a mistake. So just to reiterate, the issues that I'm trying to put before you, the importance of physical evidence, properly analysed in context, the importance of looking at complainant and witness credibility and reliability, the increased danger of wrongful convictions due to moral panic, especially in major crimes like homicide, rape and sexual assault, and increased danger of wrongful conviction due to the relative social position of the accused or accuser. So this is what I want to suggest to you as some of the issues that we ought to be interested in. These days, the world's moving on. Quite a lot of crimes these days leave a digital footprint, not a real footprint. There's a backlog in digital evidence examination at the moment in this country. There's also a change in investigative and prosecutorial procedure. It's called streamlined forensic reporting. It's really meant to be in response to the recession and a desire in principle, a reasonable desire, I think, to make criminal investigation, forensic science, prosecution more cost effective. But it does mean that evidence is not being examined to the extent that it once was. And I think there's a particular risk in certain circumstances that potentially exonerating evidence is being ignored. Potentially inculpatory evidence is also being ignored. This is evidence that might support the prosecution. And another problem that's arising is because the investigators, the police, are being encouraged to streamline their procedure. It's often not the case that exhibits are comprehensively examined unless the defence lawyer decides to speak to a forensic scientist to say, well, what should they have looked at in this case? So the burden of proof is shifting away from the prosecution, whose duty it is to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt, to the defence, where they have to say, well, could they have tested these other exhibits to see if the accused can produce evidence to exonerate them? So the burden of proof is subtly shifting away from the prosecution to the defence. Significant backlogs in digital evidence examination. That was reported in the recent Home Office Forensic Science Strategy document. Very often it's very difficult for the defence to get hold of computers and cell phones from the complainant and from the accused. The police have them, or they've been returned to their owner. The defence has to struggle to get hold of the exhibit. And in terms of digital investigation, there are requests for communications data, things like IP addresses, and serious error were known to have been made in 2014, 17 serious errors. 10 of those errors were related to requests for internet data and involved identifying innocent people with the wrong IP address. And this can just be a simple typographical error or transcription error. They write down the wrong IP address, and it connects with your laptop, and the police are going to come and knock on your door. And in some cases, it's not until they've examined the computer and they've found there's nothing on it that they've realised that they've just made a mistake. So these are, I'm not trying to say these things happen all over the place every day, but they happen often enough, and you don't want to be one of those 10 people. The other thing about streamlined forensic reporting is that the police will, in say, a sexual assault case, for example, they'll obtain a DNA profile from an intimate swab, say a vaginal swab, but in these cases very often the fact of intercourse isn't disputed, so it doesn't prove anything, because it may be a consent issue, not whether there was a sexual intercourse issue. So in some cases it seems as though the police are getting evidence, but it's not pertinent to the dispute in court, to the real issue in court. And the forensic science providers are noticing this, and they're making us aware that sometimes no attempt's been made to examine other forensic stains, body fluid stains, or damaged clothing, or other things that might allow the debate between two different accounts of events to be resolved. We're back with Susanna and the elders, that there's two stories, and that because of streamlined forensic reporting, potentially exonerating evidence is not being collected, and it's being left to the defence to check that it is and to test it. And this is going back to the States, the Innocence Project. More than 25% of cases in a US National Institute of Justice study, suspects were excluded once DNA testing was conducted. So there's a huge number of cases where when they do a DNA test, it actually shows that one or more of the suspects that they're interested in can be excluded. So this has a great deal of exonerating power. DNA is very powerful in finding evidence to support convictions of people that have committed offences, but it's also extremely powerful in exonerating the innocent if it's done properly. We're aware of these issues, and we're also very sensitive to the issues of wrongful convictions in many jurisdictions, and I'm probably a little bit more familiar with the jurisdictions based on the English common law. This is a case from Canada. There's been a number of high-profile miscarriages of justice in Canada. And this is from a report by Peter Corey, who was led an inquiry into the wrongful conviction of a man called Thomas Soffeno, which you Canadians may have heard of, a retired justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. And he reminds us that liberty is the bedrock of democracy, which means to say we don't go putting people in prison if they haven't done it, but hopefully we do if they have. And if we don't adhere to that rule, we're threatening our very own democratic principles. We must be sure that the deprivation of that fundamental liberty is appropriate and is demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt on evidence that is fair and a process that is fair. And another earlier case from the US Supreme Court regarding due process. Due process commands that no man shall lose his liberty unless the government has borne the burden of convincing the fact finder, that's the court, the jury, of his guilt. To this end, the reasonable doubt standard is indispensable, for it impresses on the trier of fact the necessity of reaching a subjective state of certitude on the facts in issue. The prosecution has to prove its case beyond reasonable doubt using evidence and a fair process. I'm sorry, this is a little bit lengthy. This is from a report by a colleague of mine in the north of England, a forensic scientist called Dr. Duncan Woods. And this concerns a man who was arrested for punching his estranged partner in the face. His jumper, that's a sweater, was seized as an exhibit because it appeared to be blood-stained. So the police thought they'd got a simple domestic. He punched his wife on the face. He'd got a blood-stained sweater where presumably it was his wife's blood that was on it because he'd punched her. He said, I did punch her, but it was only because she was trying to stab me with a kitchen knife. And sometime later on, the man's solicitor, his lawyer, asked the forensic scientists to look at the reports, and they said, well, let's have a look at this jumper. And they found that it got cut marks in the back consistent with him being stabbed in the back. But the police had chosen not to examine the exhibit properly and somehow managed to avoid drawing attention to the fact that there did seem to be evidence that the man had indeed been stabbed in the back, which of course opens up to the court the possibility of another account of events other than a simple domestic where the man's punched his wife and off he goes to prison. There's obviously a lot more to it than that. What Dr. Woods says is, how can it possibly be in the interest of victims to require them to give evidence in court when probative forensic examinations frequently result in earlier resolution? So he's saying in the case of a perfectly credible and reasonable accusation, if the evidence is tested, it may save the ordeal of somebody having to go in a witness box when the evidence is clearly there and a guilty plea might arise. He also says, the victim of a false sexual allegation is the victim of a crime. A simple role reversal from the circumstances if the allegation is true. How can it possibly be in the interest of justice to investigate only one account and resist as far as possible any forensic examinations that might provide contradictory evidence? The Director of Public Prosecution's declared desire to increase convictions for sexual offences should be based on balance and thorough investigation, not reliance on bias. Dr. Wood is, to the best of my knowledge, a man interested in forensic science. He's not a men's issues advocate. He's a justice advocate. And he's prepared to make such a declaration. How can it possibly be cost-effective to public funds to delay these examinations, resist them, or pass on the responsibility, or then try to circumvent their evidential impact? These all delay justice. I think they probably potentially do a good deal more than that as well. So why is this happening? Well, this brings me back to the thing that I haven't talked about, which is public choice politics. The policymakers don't think the votes are there, I suggest to you. This is Keir Starmer, former Director of Public Prosecutions, and he's being reported in The Guardian as saying, restoring confidence so victims report rape is key. That sort of public statement, I think, is seen as being attractive to potential voters. And a little bit further down the line, you see Sir Keir Starmer MP. He's moved from the DPP's office to Parliament. And this isn't just this is a thing that I think affects both political parties, because according to public choice theory, policymakers want to attract the interest of the median voter, and the median voter in this country, as it happens, among other things, is female. This is our present Home Secretary, Theresa May, potentially the next Prime Minister.
It's not.
And in her Home Office Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, we're offered programmes that will work with men and boys to tackle the harmful gender norms driving violence against women and girls. So this is simply the patriarchy paradigm of domestic violence, and I think I feel confident I can say from, it's not my field, but from what literature I've read, there's another case, and in my view a far more compelling case, for gender symmetry in domestic violence, for issues in intergenerational transmission of behaviour, for things like attachment issues in early caregiving that are actually far more credible as a model within which to try and solve these problems. But this is what we're getting from the Home Secretary. The Home Office are going to work with the Universities UK. That's a sort of an association of senior university directors, to establish a task force to explore what more can be done to support the higher education sector to prevent and respond to incidents of violence and sexual harassment against women on university campuses. Well, I left Toronto in 2010, and I wasn't really aware of this issue of rape culture in Canada, on university campuses in Canada in 2010. It may have been there. It's certainly become a high-profile issue in US campuses, and I anticipate, therefore, in Canadian campuses as well. But we don't have it in England. We don't have rape culture in university campuses in England yet. But we're going to get it, because it's in the strategy. Rape culture's on its way to a university near you, even if you don't realise you've got it. Turning quickly back to Canada and the Jangameshi case. I know that you Canadians will be far more familiar with it than I am. A celebrity accused of, I think, 5 counts of sexual assault and acquitted. An excellent debate hosted by the Canadian Association for Equality. If you're not familiar with that organisation, I invite you to find out all you can about it. I think they're doing a fantastic job in Canada, and I certainly wish they'd been around when I lived there. But this panel is discussing this Jangameshi case, the disputes about his guilt and the evidence in these sexual assault allegations. And I noticed that some of the issues came up. The panelist on the right, I'm afraid I can't remember his name. Can anybody? Sorry? David Butt. He was saying that the sort of making the sort of statements that I've heard from people like the former DPP Keir Starmer. So my guess would be that you've got a parliamentary candidate in the making there. Right. So you may have a butt for a prime minister. Sorry about that. I couldn't resist that. You may think perhaps you've already got one. I wouldn't like to say. I wouldn't like to say. Justin. It's not Justin Bieber, is it? It's. Please forgive me for that. So in this case, the biblical rabble has turned into the Twitter mob, and there's a fundamental issue here with this debate, and I think it's a debate that's coming to the fore in wider society, whether we want democracy or what some people argue is social democracy. Do we want justice or do we want social justice? And I think that everything we know about history tells us we need justice. A lot of people have struggled to put in place these safeguards for all of us, and we let them be eroded away at our peril. Ghomeshi was found not guilty on 5 charges. One factor that seems to have helped him is that he managed to keep his emails from 13 years previously. So he got that evidence, amongst other things, regarding the credibility and reliability of his accusers and of his version of events. The same sort of issues that may have arisen in antiquity. And finally, I want to leave my last word to this lady, Jean Ghomeshi's lawyer, Marie Henine. And there's a wonderful clip of an interview with a very well-known Canadian TV interviewer called Peter Mansbridge, interviewing Marie Henine after the Ghomeshi case. And she said, #I believe, this is the I believe the accuser, #I believe is not a legal principle, nor should it ever be, because you can't believe people based on who they are or the nature of the crime. And we knew that 2,200 years ago. We would never want that, and historically, when it has happened, it has never been to the benefit of the most disadvantaged or the most marginalised. And I tried to think of some examples where of guilt by accusation. I'm afraid the examples are very, very unattractive. There's a big conflict in Islam between Shia and Sunni Muslims, and it's probably in only some of those Islamic countries where the group that holds power can basically point the finger at you, and if you're from the other group, you're toast whatever you've done. You might actually be the victim, but you're the one that's going to be convicted. The other dreadful example, and I mention it with reluctance because it's probably mentioned too much, but I think it's absolutely true, and that is in Nazi Germany. A German could accuse a Jew could not accuse a German. It may well be that the Jew was the victim of a crime, but he or she finishes up being prosecuted and punished, even though they're not only innocent, they're a victim. The examples of guilt by accusation are profoundly unattractive. And we don't presumptively believe police officers. We don't presumptively believe politicians or priests or whatever it is. But it sure does get you a lot of votes, doesn't it? So I think Marie's right on the ball there. I gather from my Canadian friends that Marie describes herself as a feminist, but I think she may have been having a day off when she said that. So that's the end of my talk, ladies and gentlemen. I hope it's been of interest to you. Thank you.
Okay, so about just over a year ago, I actually did jury service, and it was really interesting, the cases that I was not going to talk about in any detail. But one of the things that really interested me was the fact that as a juror, I couldn't ask questions that weren't in the evidence presented. So there was things I wanted to know about things like timing and stuff that would have been really pertinent that neither the prosecution nor defence have brought up. Is it something you think that perhaps maybe jurors should be permitted to cross-examine as well, to make sure that we can get as much detail as possible?
Sure. Well, I'm kind of reluctant to pretend that I can give you a properly informed answer, because it's really a question for a good lawyer. But certainly in terms of juries in this country, in contrast to the United States, the jury's deliberations are confidential and they're in private. So that's one reason why I can understand your reluctance to talk about the cases. The other thing is that in principle, very often I understand it's the judge decides what can go in the case. The judge decides what's relevant. Prior to that, the Crown Prosecution Service will have decided what evidence it wants to put before the court on the basis of what's been provided by the police, and the defence will have their say. And very often there'll be a debate that the jury won't be privy to regarding what can or cannot be included in the trial. So there are quite strict rules, procedural rules regarding what, to the best of my knowledge, what appears in court. What seems to be happening, perhaps as a consequence of TV programmes like CSI, is that jurors are asking more and more questions. They want to know why this and that wasn't tested. And it's a bit of a problem for the lawyers now, because, you know, the jury's asking for this and the court hasn't, it's not being presented in the court, so that is an issue. Well, I think that this is probably just a personal point of view, that I think it's perfectly reasonable that the jury should want issues to be resolved. I can see that the lawyers and investigators might feel that sometimes the jury's questions are not necessarily very wise or well informed, but that's a separate matter. You know, that the 12 good men and women and true are really a very important aspect of the justice system, and the more they feel that they're properly informed to arrive at their verdict, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
So the reason why I raised was the fact that one was actually domestic violence case,
right.
The other was related to filming in public and things like that. Right. Fair enough. Yeah.
Could you tell a little bit about the work of the place where you work?
The cases that I showed came from some years ago when I worked at Sheffield Medico-Legal Centre, which had a catchment of a large part of northern England, so that the cases involving skeletal remains I'd very often be asked to analyse. Frankly, there weren't that many. I'm pleased to tell you that the murder rate in this country is very, very low, and there weren't that many of these cases, but they were often very interesting, and some of they're all important, of course, but some of them involved quite serious crimes, homicide. One interesting case, my graduate students did a forensic facial reconstruction from the skull that went on Crime Watch on national television, and as a consequence of which the victim was identified, and as it turns out, his son and grandson were ultimately convicted of his murder. But I mean, I want to try and reinforce the point that I made early on, that the forensic stuff's interesting and all well and good, but what we really want is a safer, happier, healthier society. So the question is how we take these kind of unfortunate incidents that occur and turn that around somehow so that we can reduce their likelihood.
Thanks, Martin.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, Martin Evison.
Thank you very much. Thank you.